What? Oh my goodness. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Brigard. Thank you, Breezy. I kind of feel like we just have to stand here for a moment. I gotta sit there for a moment and just like appreciate that journey. We were like up, we calmed down, we shaked our butts. Thank you for being here. This is so awesome to look out and see so many of you. I know many of you, but for many of you, I'm new. My name is June A. It's both parts, June and A. June like the month, A like the letter. My pronouns are she, they. I'm with Income Movement, and I help coordinate the Movement Building Coalition. For the sake of time, we're just going to go really quickly and introduce ourselves briefly, and then we'll just hop into the session.
Hey everybody, I am Minister Janae Bates. You can just call me Janae. I use she, her pronouns. I am the communications director for Isaiah and Faith in Minnesota. And we organize communities of faith, Black-owned barbershops, child care centers, young folks, a whole lot of folks. We have a constituency of about 500,000 people that we organize in the state of Minnesota.
Ooh. Tough to follow. Janae, always. Minister Janae is going to inspire us today, and I'm Hala Ahmed. I am the VP for Policy at JFI, and I've supported a lot of pilots with communications, driven also by both data and participants of the pilots' input into the narrative change efforts.
Hi everyone, thank you so much to my lovely panelists. My name is Shafika Hashash. I am the program manager of our lovely National Guaranteed Income Community of Practice. So it's so great to see so many of you in person. For anyone who may not know, the Guaranteed Income Community of Practice is a huge group of anyone and everyone working on guaranteed income: policymakers, funders, researchers, academics, and of course, our core, our pilot programs, and folks who just really center their work on guaranteed income. So I'm pleased to be here with the Economic Security Project. Thanks so much.
Ooh. Thanks, everybody. So narrative change is at the top of most everyone's minds. It comes up in our conversations, in our work, and we also know this because at Income Movement, we've been surveying y'all for like 6 months. I'm going to share some community data a little bit later, but to set that up, we're first going to hear from Janae, who's going to give us a great and inspiring example of how narrative change can shift policy and create policy change.
Well, thank you. Hopefully it's inspiring. So I'm going to talk to you about the lovely state of Minnesota, where we just had an incredible last 5 months, where we had some major wins. And this is a graphic that we created. It's an old one, actually, because everything where you see that's coming soon, we have won. So, yeah. So it takes a whole lot longer than 5 months to win these kinds of things, as you all can imagine. But in the state of Minnesota, in this legislative session, just a few of the things that I want to highlight. We won a statewide paid family medical leave program. We won, and it is one of the best in the country, quite frankly, because it includes everyone. And has made a huge impact on racial and gender disparities. We will have statewide sick time. We have made massive investments in childcare, public education. We have in-state free college tuition. We have $1 billion that went into housing. We passed a child tax credit, a public option for healthcare that also includes undocumented folks. We have free phone calls for incarcerated families. I mean, we passed a lot of crap, y'all. A lot. So how do you do things like that? Well, let me tell you. So this was 10 years in the making. A huge amount of investment, most certainly in organizing and in narrative work. Because the reality is you don't get stuff like this until you actually commit to folks like this. It was about organizing those folks that I told you, 500,000 people that just our organization has been organizing, but we worked with labor unions, we worked with workers' rights unions, we worked with, Immigration rights, folks, we were really about creating a multiracial democracy that worked for everyone, that created a caring economy in the state of Minnesota. And so the huge thing that we had to do is get clear about our narrative. And that meant that we got to work together across coalitions to be able to inspire one another to do that kind of work, but also meant we had to get really grounded in what we were for. That is something we're not always great at. And I felt really encouraged being in this space because you have all talked a lot about what you're for, about believing that all folks are deserving, that really pushing back on this idea that there are some who aren't deserving. And so what we did in the state of Minnesota is we embraced something called the race, class, gender narrative. Some of you have maybe heard of it as the race class narrative, but we are most certainly intentional about including gender as well, because we know that dog whistles happen, definitely race-based dog whistles, but also genderized dog whistles are used to create wedges in our communities to get us to a point where we don't want to work with and for one another to create a government that works for all of us. And so, there's basically three components to race-class narrative, race-class gender narrative that makes it actually sing. But let me go back really quick, because this is a really important piece that I really want to land with you all. We talk a lot about narrative, and we talk a lot about messaging, and you're going to hear a lot of great things about it and take it all in. But one thing I want you to be clear about when it comes to messaging, what actually makes a good message, and this is coming from someone who has done both the research and the implementation of messaging, it is not about a bunch of fancy words that I get to create in a room with a bunch of smart people. It's actually the words that we pull from community members and that they are willing to repeat over and over and over again. A good message is a message that will be repeated. And so the core of race, class, gender narrative is creating messaging that our base, our people, regular folks, not just the activists in this room, because I'm sorry to tell y'all, we are literally less than 1% of the population. I am talking about the massive amount of folks who are just out in the world trying to live their best life. Those folks need to be able to grasp messaging that they are willing to repeat over and over and over again to their aunties, their cousins, their neighbors. And so with race, class, gender narrative, we know that there are three things that helps it to sing. First, it starts with your value, which sounds real simple, but it is really hard for us, because on the left, in the progressive world, we like to talk about problems a lot. Everything sucks. Everything's terrible. This doesn't work. This is broken, bureaucratic, right. I know it sounds familiar because you might have said it, right? But here's the thing. We start with a value, a shared value that cuts across race, class, gender, income, age, even partisanship for some folks. And so this is an example of that, what we use for our paid family medical leave program, where we talked about the fact that every single family deserves to be able to care for one another because we care for one another. We want to care for our bodies, we want to care for our families, we want to care for our loved ones, right? So you start with a shared value. The next thing that you have to talk about, which is going to be probably the hardest thing for most of us in the room, is you got to name your villain. We suck at that. As a matter of fact, and what we will probably say is the villain is a system. It's racism, it's classism, it's sexism, it's xenophobia. I agree, all those things suck, but when you go out and tell people in the public realm that that is the villain, they're like, okay, I can't do nothing about that. That is like God or the weather or osmosis. It happens. What am I supposed to do about that? And so we have to be way better storytellers. And if you think about the greatest story you've ever heard, I bet you there's a protagonist who is bomb diggity, and there is a villain, and it is not the air. Right? And so you have to have a real villain. We have to stop using systems, because I'll tell you this, when we say that housing is increasingly unaffordable for people, especially black folks, folks here, we in this room are like, yes, that's true. Oh my goodness, we gotta come against the machine. People in the world hear that and be like, dang, them black folks is so messing up that they can't afford rent. It's increasingly unaffordable. Did it just happen? It just rises by itself? We're actually not naming the way in which corporate developers have decided to charge people out of the wazoo, extracting and exploiting from families, and most certainly doing it to black and brown people because they know they can get away with it, because they know that white folks sometimes ain't gonna stand up for them. Is that what happens? We actually need to tell a fuller story. So what we did with a coalition called We Make Minnesota is that we came together, a bunch of organizations, a bunch of labor unions, a bunch of folks who were really committed to raising revenue. And I will say this, we decided to raise revenue in a state in a year where we had a $17 billion surplus. We had a $17 billion surplus, and I'll tell y'all this, because this is important. I don't want to go over time, but I want y'all to hear this. We had a $17 billion surplus, and you know what the rhetoric was? Give the money back. Give it back to the people. And that might sound real familiar, because maybe some of y'all in here might have said something like that. But I will tell you this, that rhetoric was grounded in a right-wing framework that was saying, we want to make sure that this goes back to the wealthiest Minnesotans and the biggest corporations. And we will say give it back because we want those very wealthy folks to get billions, and those who are in poverty and low income probably get nothing, maybe pennies. But we'll say give it back. That ain't right. Thank you. Instead, what we should be saying is that it is time that we actually take the funding. The reason we have a $17 billion surplus is because we chose for years to divest from our housing, from our healthcare, from our school system. And we said, oh, we don't need to fund that because it's a bunch of black and brown folks there, because it's a bunch of low-income folks there, because it's a bunch of women there. No. And so we decided to come together and say, you know what? That's not going to fly. We are going to come together across race, class, income, gender, what have you, and ensure that we fund this state, and we're going to fund all of the things that we need to survive and thrive. And that means that we're going to make sure that we're putting that $17 billion into the things we need, and we're going to go and get more because we can. So we need to raise the taxes for those who are the wealthiest because they have to pay what they owe. Not pay their fair share, because they ain't did that in a long time. They actually have to pay us back pay from what they've been owed, right? Mm-hmm. And so it was about making sure that we do that, and that we're also taking care of those who are really, really hurting. And they're not hurting because they chose to. They're hurting because the very same corporations who were making record profits during a pandemic, because let's be for real, also chose to push their wages low, who show up at the Capitol the same way I do, except they're saying, no, we need much lower wages. We don't need paid leave for everyone. We need to ensure that people work their behinds off and get as little as possible. That ain't right. And we can do something about it. So when you call out the villains explicitly, that actually gives all of the public, those public regular people, to be able to understand, oh, I have a choice. I have a clear moral choice. And so that's what we did. So what you see in front of you on the left-hand side is a graphic that we used that was really telling a particular story, because in Minnesota, I just told you, we want a child tax credit, actually the largest in the country this year, where every single family, no matter how many children you have, you get $1,750 per child. Okay, if your income is under $35,000, and then it's progressively, stretched up until $65,000 a year.
That's the largest in the country.
That is the largest in the country. It also includes if you make no income. Okay, and it is ongoing, because mind you, if we did not raise revenue, if we didn't go and get more money, then they would have been like, okay, well, we'll use some of the $17 billion for that, and it'll happen one time, and that's it. This is continuing. But I'll tell you this, there was a big public fight about it. And the public fight was that there were folks on the other side in opposition who said, no, we need to cut Social Security tax. Now, I hear some of y'all already hear that is a terrible idea for a lot of different reasons, but in Minnesota, the poorest folks who are on Social Security already don't pay a tax, okay? It was really those who were between $50,000 and up who were paying a tax on Social Security. And they said, no, we want to get rid of it all entirely, which would cost the state $1.7 billion per year, ongoing, and it would increase. And I hate talking to y'all about numbers because that is actually not very good narrative work, but I need you to understand why this is so incredibly important. Because what we were able to do, all that stuff that I named that we were able to pass, The fight we were up against were people saying, no, give it to the wealthiest Minnesotans. Those who are making $250,000 a year, they need an extra golf club. But they wouldn't say it like that. They were just yelling, give it back. Which means we have to be very intentional about what we say. And so when we make very, very clear choices for people, then we can talk about the things that we want, the things we can have, the things we deserve. Like what you see here where it says cleaner air. Another thing in the state of Minnesota that we won was 100% clean energy by 2040. That meant cleaner air, because people are like, clean energy, what does that mean? But cleaner air, healthier water. We are literally removing every single lead pipe in the state of Minnesota so that we won't have the issue of Flint, Michigan. Like, those are things that only happen because we are clear about talking about our values and then our villains. But we got to end it with one thing. We got to talk about our vision. And this very happy-go-lucky white man you see right here, that is our mayor, our governor, Tim Walz, in the state of Minnesota after he signed the bill for free breakfast and lunches for every single child in the state of Minnesota. So every single student gets a free lunch and a free breakfast at school. Those are the kinds of things that are possible. Those are the kinds of visions that we can all have and cast together and work for together when we are clear about our values, when we name the villain explicitly, and then we cast that vision of what we can do together. Okay, that's my time.
Thank you so much, Minister Janae, for ministering to all of us that we all need to move to Minnesota, which is sounding a lot like Canada. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how some of those ideas get applied within the guaranteed income space, but this is really just, first of all, we have limited time, but this is just the beginning of the conversation, partially because we have a lot of breakout sessions which apply some messaging and narrative change ideas in really practical ways. But also this is the work of the movement building cohort and income movement and the GICP and a lot of folks in this room who are building practical tactics for us all to use in the guaranteed income community to try to be centered in a consistent set of values and build towards narrative and policy change. So, how do I work? Okay. A quick time check. Do we have 10 minutes or 30 minutes? Or, because we're going over it. When is
going quite a bit over. So
they were saying 3:40? Okay, okay, just checking. So we all understand narrative change is a key priority in this community, but what is narrative change? I won't spend a lot of time on this because a lot of folks have been discussing it, but it changes our common sense understandings of what are the problems and what are the solutions, and that has to do with also naming the villains. Who do we understand is at fault for the situations that we see, and therefore what are the solutions and who's accountable. They also help us diagnose our relationship to the problem. They help us change how we see our relationship to each other. And they protect our wins. And that's really important as well because in the child tax credit, we were so excited to celebrate that win, but did we have the narrative change, the basis to permanently destroy a work requirement for a child's allowance in this country? We did not. And that's still work to be done. What types of narratives do we want to change? Well, I'm not going to run through this as well, but just a few that come up a lot in our conversations across the movement. We want to address some of the same things that folks across progressive movements and pro-democracy organizations in this country are working on, changing our ideas about the causes of poverty and moving from ideas of individual accountability to systemic causes, but still being able to name the villain and not saying that the villain is a system, because that is not really workable for organizing. And then some of them are specific to basic income. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. One of the important transitions that we need to make together is to shift from talking about cash to talking about the future that cash creates. And that means the same way that they were trying to turn clean energy into clean air for us and our kids, we need to talk about cash in terms of healthcare, dignity, caring for our kids, thriving in stable communities, and all of this language I've heard some folks use, but we use it in different spaces, in different ways, and inconsistently across the movement. And we can tap into some of the race, class, gender narrative toolkits that progressive data messaging experts have built and which are adaptable to individual contexts and communities. But I want to talk, there are a lot of resources out there. I won't get into all of them. This is not a complete list either, but I just want to mention that a lot of folks are in this work, but it's time to get coordinated. So what are some of the ways to do narrative change? Not a complete list, but messaging is just one part of narrative change. We think about it as our communications plans. We think about it as our talking points, but it also has to do with making sure that we are using some of the same key words. And like Janae said, these key words should come from our community, should be words that people will repeat, because a good message is only as good as how repeated it is. We want to have shared vocabulary and definitions. Even within the guaranteed income space, some of us are using direct cash transfers, some of us are using basic income, some of us guaranteed income, and some of us define those things a little bit differently. So getting consistent and trying to be consistent, at least within our value frames for those things, is very important next step for us. Janae and folks in the income movement will be doing a lot of work on storytelling. A lot of folks are talking about storytelling, but there's a transition to be made from storytelling for media to storytelling in public narrative, and public narrative as a tool for organizing, so that a personal story, we'll get into this later, becomes a collective story and an urgent story of now, with a demand for us to collectively meet that need. There's also an element of counter-narrative, and counter-narrative a lot of folks get into in a little bit of a tricky way. So researchers can think of themselves as contributing to counter-narrative because you're looking for the right questions to ask and pointing to systemic causes for the poverty that folks are in, for the systems that people exist in. And so it contributes to changing our perceptions of individual accountability and sense of deservedness. But we also have to be careful with counter-narrative that we are not repeating the language of folks who are working towards different ends. So I'm going to contradict that rule right now, but for example, folks use the term tax relief a lot. Where did tax relief come from? Well, in the Bush administration, they used that word every single day, all the time, for months and months and months, and it became really common parlance to refer to taxes as a type of burden and relief. Well, how are we going to fund the future that we're looking for and the public services that we're looking for and the cash that we're looking for? It's not through tax relief. It may be through tax credits and whatnot. Some of those policy options are real and great, but we need to think about some of the frames that are elicited there. And then also policy contributes to this narrative shift. So sometimes short-term wins or the child tax credit, they create an inflection point for us to change our expectations of government and to push people's imagination about what they can ask for, what demands are realistic. Did we know that a state could fund a $1,750 child tax credit? No, we didn't, but Minnesota said we could, so we learned that lesson. So I'm going to try to get to Janae and Shafika, who have a lot of really great gems to share as well. But I want to point out one important thing about the different messaging frames that we're using. When Janae was mentioning that we need to speak to a shared vision and shared values, when we look at the common sets of values that we have for basic income, some of them can be a little bit divergent. And there are folks who would like to say, well, let's look at the political context of our locality, and yeah, we'll use some conservative language in this context, even if it contradicts the language that I would use more broadly within the guaranteed income space or that speak more directly to my values. And so we need to be careful in looking through this set of language about how that shows up. Are we characterizing the government as so burdensome and broken that people are inclined towards a more conservative frame that wouldn't fund our futures through robust public institutions and cash transfers administered by the government and not private philanthropy? So we need to be careful about using that language and centering really, I think, what often gets sidelined, which is that last one of human dignity. I think this will be the last thing I speak to, so we can move to all the breakouts and all the next content. But there's a really important framework that I mentioned earlier today, which is not only do we have to reflect our shared values and get aligned on some of those shared values so that we can adapt messaging based on shared values, but maybe not always the exact same iterations of messages. But we need to make sure that our messages are consistent with the demands of our constituencies. And that may mean that a coalition in DC or New York or all the other folks that are represented here that is organizing around child welfare has a set of demands that include a form of cash assistance, but it's not the $1,500 a month that you would actually need to afford a basic, apartment in DC these days. Gentrification is real. But it may be a set of other demands that include paid leave or affordable childcare or a whole host of other progressive demands. The other important thing to start incorporating within our narrative change work is data. But I will say that we need to make sure that that data is checked against those first 2 bullet points. So sometimes data will tell you that people don't like guaranteed income and that people have really messed up ideas about people who are poor. And we will not respond to that data. We will also assert our messages and our values through repetition, through the work that we do. And lastly, storytelling as a tactic for organizing. I talked about that a little bit. This is what Janae was talking about with regard to the race class narrative and We Make the Future Toolkit. This is a national framework, and I recommend folks look into it and incorporate it more. And it involves subtly changing our language in ways that we can see is really effective for building winning campaigns. And now I'm going to pass to Janae to talk a little bit about the movement building cohort.
I have just one slide, so if you want to hold on to that, and then when I'm done, we can click over for Shafika. Can you click over one? Thank you. So I'm going to be brief, but I'm really excited to share this data with you. We have been working with y'all, working with the community for the last 6 months or so. In the fall, more than that. In the fall, we did a community survey. We did a big series of roundtable interviews with around 70 people. In the winter, we've been working with y'all in our State of the Movement quarterly meetings, and over and over and over again, when we've asked you what you want, creating wide-reaching viral popular media with influencers, celebrities, and people with notoriety has come up. You guys want narrative change. You want to work on messaging. You want to have a strategic plan for how to shift some of the myths that are out there around poverty. So we want to go a little bit deeper with you for just a moment and get more data from you. So we have a QR code on the back of your name tag, and we would love to get more community data. So one of the things with the Movement Building Coalition is that we're centering community. As you heard from Janae and Hala, messaging needs to come from us. We need to be using it all the time. So when you click on that QR code, you're going to bring up a survey, and we're going to have 3 questions to ask you. One is about which false narratives should we focus on in the Movement Building Coalition. One is going to be about framing, and one is going to be about which formats should we start looking at for running nationwide campaigns together. So if you want to just take a couple seconds to pop that up and answer those questions, that would be great. Thank you. Okay, so while you're finishing that up, I'm going to pass the mic over to Shafika, and she's going to talk to us a little bit about what's happening in the narrative change space at the
Sure.
GICP.
And then just to be clear, we have that first slide up with the forest. All right, great. So I'm going to share some tidbits, and some things might feel repetitive, but repetition is key. You know, Matt Muse 12, it really works. It's still in the head. So I know that in, the last years, if you do narrative work, you've seen so many images to try and represent it, but I really like this one. So we're gonna start with this image looking at the leaves here. And the leaves represent stories. They're colorful, they're pretty, they inspire everyone. But stories by themselves, or these leaves by themselves, are just a pile of leaves. And that can be okay. A pile of stories is lovely, but they can really serve a higher purpose. Stories champion build. They power build folks to be delivering messages. They also create them as their own leaders. So we don't just do story cohorts for story cohorts' sake, but it's for that power building efforts. So those stories are also crucial in making sure that your messages are really exemplary. The messages are the trees here. Without the stories, your message trees, they're kind of ugly. They're uninteresting, they're boring, they're just words on a paper. These messages, though, are adaptable, and you should adapt them to different contexts. If you're talking to a legislative group versus a set of community organizers, if you focus on housing, the formerly incarcerated, childcare, but in adapting these messages, this is where folks sometimes start neglecting those values. And I will talk more about values, but my co-panelists did such a good job of that I don't even really feel the immense need to. But those values in those messages need to stay strong, because those message trees with those story leaves make up our narrative forest. And the narrative forest is persistent, it's persuasive, it has the values embedded in it. And if your trees didn't have those values, well, then your forest didn't go anywhere. We can move to the next slide. I say all this because I was asked to answer something kind of specific here in my discussion with you all. And it's something that folks often ask me, which is, how can you make sure everyone is staying on message, that all the organizations are advancing a fantastic narrative rooted in values? And the truth is, we individually can't, right? We can't create all the strategic plans we want, as many as humanly possible that are fantastic. But if each person and each organization isn't feeling accountable to these values and holding themselves accountable, then it wouldn't work. I don't vet every organization's social media post before they go out. You also, I assume, do not have the time to do so. I don't vet pilots that are getting started and say, like, well, this is really what you should do instead. I can provide that advice, and I love when we're asked, and we do. But it really is that accountability point to make sure that your work of guaranteed income is rooted in trust, freedom, stability, and we're not sliding back on those values because it's easier when we do work and slide on those values. It's easier to just talk about the people finding new employment, because that's what's, so nice for, lots of folks to hear. But I will say, I mentioned not vetting things, but why not? If you want to get people's input, you're not sure, you're new at this, you work at a nonprofit and you are the program manager, the comms person, the social media, and the person who answers questions from the public, then ask folks, take that advice. So in terms of accountability, it's important to say what I will be accountable to. So I commit in our resources that we provide the community of practice to ensure that these values are always centered. Those resources go out to you all a lot of times, and we love it. You use it for your own community work, so it's very important that they're always centered and rooted in these values. So to make my section as fruitful as possible, I've put up some key messages to help you, because that's what people often like to see. So guaranteed income is more than a check. It's fill in the blank. If we had more time, I was actually going to really go through some audience folks and get some, but I'll give you some that have come out through the day. It's greater stability in marriage, as President Preckwinkle named earlier. It's a soccer uniform that makes your child happy and really wanting to go and be involved in extracurricular activities. It's less stress. It's attending prenatal appointments. Yes, it's also rent, it's also food, but it's also a family vacation to create lifelong memories. Don't fall into the trap where all your message is talking about is rent and basic needs, rent and basic needs. Rent and basic needs, very important. Can't live without them, gotta love them, you know? But we talk about trusting folks. We talk about wanting them to live their fullest lives and to thrive, and that is not just rent and basic needs. Guaranteed income is part of creating an economy that works for all. Do not fall into the trap that all you have to talk about is poverty. You know, I make the joke that I love my GICP members so much, but sometimes we talk about it as though like we're helping the poors, as opposed to building an economy that's working better for all of us in this room too. You know, the economy works for a very small chunk of people right now. And, you know, most of us here, if not all, it's not. We're not that chunk of people. Our participants in the programs, not that chunk of people. We're building a better and more just economy. Cash gives families tools, freedom, opportunity, and choice to care for their families. It's so important, and I love that so many folks have mentioned the care economy. It's not just about, oh, and then with the cash, they got a better job. That's fantastic. I love to hear that. But it's not just about people going out and working. It's okay to stay and care for your children or your mother, you know, the sandwich generation. It's okay to say, I spent that money to care for myself because I was going to have a nervous breakdown. If in messaging we're sliding back on work and, you know, we're doing more of that work and worth nonsense, if we slide back that only poverty photos are the ones to show and not a kid who got an ice cream or a family on the beach and they've never been able to go to the beach, then we're just making that narrative hill that much harder for ourselves. You know, it's easy to join a coalition. Literally, to join the GICP, it's gicp.info/join. People think it's like a magical thing. It's very easy. But holding yourselves accountable, holding ourselves accountable is a lot harder. When we create our social media posts, our materials, our legislative advocacy, accountability to these values is the most important thing. Last slide. But again, you're not creating these things from scratch. So I want to reshare some wonderful resources. Hala had mentioned a few. Everyone here, I'm sure, has others. But remember, these resources are help you to keep those values-based messages centered. So this is literally just a few. I don't think all of the resources could ever fit on a slide, not just from the GICP, but from so many of our other great national partners here. There's a storytelling guide. Replicate it. Copy it, delete my logo, add your logo. That's literally the point. It has a bill of rights for storytellers. It has how to hold these events, has all these great things because again, we are not naive to the fact that nearly everyone here wears so many hats where they work. We have our narrative cohorts with monthly meetings. Bring your questions. They're casual, they're lunch and learns. Bring your lunch, bring your questions, you know, feel quote unquote dumb. Like it's a great space for it. We have strategic investments. Big shout out to our current narrative subgrants, folks working on the formerly incarcerated, the undocumented, Springboard to the Arts, you know, all of these great people here. And those investments, if you're a national partner, please keep making them. Advisory committees. We have one for all of our messaging work. Many other pilots here do as well. I know the Grow Fund mentioned theirs earlier in a breakout session. I know others do. But those are important. Make sure you're actually talking to people. It's not that hard to talk to people and say, does this actually work for you, yes or no? There's a multitude of trainings and workshops, everything from giving great interviews and sharing stories. Again, attend them, record them, reuse them. They are publicly available for that purpose. Really quick, I would love to hear a clap if anyone has ever used any of these resources that are provided. And if you haven't, they are there. And last, the very last thing is there's a national network here. There's a community of practice. There's people here not even part of the community of practice. We hope you'll join us. But there's a national network to join, to borrow from, to also hold yourselves accountable to. Because this national network has a North Star vision of advancing a guaranteed income rooted in trust and self-determination. Thanks, guys.
everyone. That was so awesome. I just want to say that if you also want to get your hands dirty and dig into this work, consider joining the Movement Building Coalition. This is a broad, intersectional, nationwide coalition of people, including pilot recipients, activists, organizations, funders, distribution platforms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's everybody, and it's open. And we're going to start creating some campaigns. We're going to use some of this data that you already saw and some of the data that you gave us today. We're going to roll that out in the breakout sessions later, so it will not be lost, and we'll keep feeding it back to you guys for more and more feedback so we can refine based on what the community wants. My name is Junae. You can email me or stop me in the hall. We also have how to join the Movement Building Coalition QR codes all around. So thank you, and thank you, everybody. That was so inspiring.